This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. Today's episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. I keep several maps of the Twin Cities metro area at my desk at work, and they show housing patterns, wastewater pipes, freeways, and other features of the urban landscape. Some of them are really specific and some are pretty broad. But one of the most prominent features, obviously, is the borders of the many cities that make up the region. And we kept getting reader questions about one city in particular, Maplewood. And as I looked at it on my map, I could see why. Maplewood is arguably the strangest shaped city in the Twin Cities metro area. It has somewhat of an L shape, which wraps around the northern and eastern edges of St. Paul. One of the readers who wanted to know more about Maplewood's borders was Kay Hatlestad. Here's Kay.
I live in Maplewood, Minnesota, and I have been curious about both the shape and development of Maplewood, partially because my brother and my grandfather worked at 3M, but also because the part of Maplewood I live in is sandwiched between Little Canada and St. Paul and has some fairly old housing stock there and fairly small lots. Well, if you go down to the southern end, down near 494, you've got these great big lots and not all that much developed. And then, of course, there's the shape. I still remember taking my daughter to volleyball, where I would spend 25 minutes driving rush hour through St. Paul to get from one part of Maplewood to another. So I've just always wondered about Maplewood and basically how it developed.
Thanks to Kay for that question. I'm chatting today with Greta Kaul, who wrote a story on this topic for Curious Minnesota. Well, Greta, thanks so much for joining us today. So first of all, you're sort of an East Metro native.
Yeah, I grew up in the East Metro. I grew up in Afton. So Maplewood is kind of, I was a big Maplewood Mall girl in my middle school and high school years. So.
You even went to the dentist at a spot we're going to be talking about later.
I did. That was my childhood dentist.
Historic Maplewood.
Exactly.
So, so you got some roots in this area we're going to be talking about.
I have long had questions about this, so I'm so happy to be answering it for readers and myself.
Okay. And so for the listeners out there, like somebody might see this title of this podcast and be like, Maplewood? What is Curious going to do a podcast on every suburban border or whatever? And the answer is no. And we probably won't do many, if any more of them. Maybe one more. I've heard Crystal and New Hope are interesting. But why are we focusing on Maplewood?
Yeah, so we're focusing on Maplewood not only because it has a really, really strange shape. If you think about most cities, they're mostly kind of rectangular, except for any lakes and rivers that might get in the way and other cities and things like that. They tend to have kind of boring boundaries. That is not the case with Maplewood, which some might contend is the most strangely shaped city in Minnesota. It really sticks out on a map if you haven't looked at it. If you have, you've probably noticed it. And
it really defines the shape of St. Paul, right?
It really, yes. Maplewood hasn't been around for that long, but since it has been around, it has been kind of a bulwark on the east side of St. Paul, preventing St. Paul from expanding any further into the East Metro.
And we should also just note, we did a podcast on why Minneapolis didn't gobble up its suburbs. There's a lot of similar themes to these stories about unincorporated townships becoming villages and incorporating to avoid annexation and other things. So I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes because there's a West Metro tale that is similar to this one. So Maplewood, what the heck does this thing look like? It's such a strange shape. So paint an audio picture for us. What does it look like?
So Maplewood defies easy description, I would say, but perhaps the best descriptors I have come upon in reporting this story was one person called it like an L. So you kind of have one part and then a really long skinny part that shoots down to the right of that.
Right. And anyway, if you're looking at St. Paul and you kind of like go to the northeast of it, you're going to be seeing Maplewood.
Yeah. Sometimes you don't even know when you're passing into Maplewood, except I think the street signs change. It looks very much like the east side of St. Paul. Okay.
So to start the story, we have to go back to the 1840s.
Yeah. The 1840s is when Minnesota was first surveyed by the federal government, and they split the state up into 6 by 6 mile squares that were townships. So you get a township, you get a township, you get a township. These were these squares all across the map that defined sort of the early geography of the state.
Right. And one thing I just want to note is and we talk about this with the West Metro story, in cities like in the South and Western parts of the United States, this wasn't always the case. And so it just defines the growth of our area in a way, like how this all went down. But anyway, okay, so we have all these townships. When do they get their names?
Yeah, so the townships in this area at least get their names around the time Minnesota became a state in 1858. So you get, in this area, you get McLean Township. So that's the area kind of, if you think about where 3M is and then where the east side of St. Paul is. And then sort of to the northwest of that area, you get New Canada Township.
Okay.
So 2 townships.
And I'm just going to make a plug here. We're sitting here talking about a lot of complicated geography. We're doing our best to make this super simple. But if you really want to see it on a map, click on the link I'm going to put in the show notes. And there's actually 2 maps on the story that really help illuminate some of what we're talking about here. So, okay, you have these 2 townships. They're basically these big squares. And townships are kind of vulnerable, right? I mean, because they're not incorporated.
Yeah, so where you think about a city like St. Paul has kind of these defined borders. It's a city. Townships are a little bit different in that they were surveyed and sort of defined by the federal government, but they were not immune to being annexed. So a city could decide to annex an area that was unincorporated and kind of gobble up that area.
Right, and so St. Paul takes that opportunity.
Yes.
Basically. We're talking about the 2 specific ones, the McLean and New Canada.
Yeah, so St. Paul takes the first bites out of these townships in a series of annexations through the 1880s. It's gobbling up bits of McLean and New Canada Township as it expands both to the north and to the east.
Right.
And St. Paul comes almost all the way to the eastern edge of McLean Township. Just that little leg is left. And at some point, McLean Township just decides to turn into part of New Canada Township because there's so little left there.
Right. So when you look at this skinny leg of Maplewood, what you're kind of looking at is where St. Paul stopped its annexations, essentially.
Exactly. Yep.
Right. Okay. To the east, at least. Okay. So, and that goes through when, like the 1880s or so?
Yep. That goes through the 1880s that St. Paul is doing this series of expansions.
Okay. And the townships merge together.
Yep. So those 2 townships merge together. You no longer have McLean Township on the map. You just have New Canada, this sort of squarish township, then with this leg going down left.
Okay. And we're going to talk about what happens to that new township in just a moment.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
And we're back. Okay, so the townships have merged. So now we sort of have there's some suburbanization starting, even like 19th century suburbanization where there's chunks that are starting to get eaten away.
Yeah, I don't think they would have called it suburbanization yet. I think that's a mid-century, 20th century concept.
These are like villages popping up or something.
Yes, there was actually a designation under state law called a village. So the northeastern area breaks away after a Civil War veteran comes back to Minnesota, decides he's seen enough death and destruction, and decides he wants to create this working man's utopia of North St. Paul. So the village of North St. Paul is incorporated and takes a chunk out of New Canada Township. So the New Canada Township that is left is slightly more strangely shaped.
Right. Okay. And so that's in the 1880s.
Yeah, that's in the 1880s.
And then we got to fast forward like more than half a century to Little Canada breaking off.
Yeah. So then in kind of the northwest area of what was New Canada Township, you get Little Canada breaking off into its own village. It incorporates and it sort of protects its little area from annexation, leaving an even more strange looking shape.
And when does that happen?
So that happens in the 1950s.
Okay. So World War II is over, and suddenly you've got a housing boom that's going to sort of transform the Twin Cities metro area.
Yeah, so you get all these GIs coming back from World War II, and this is a story probably people know pretty well. But there's a baby boom. People are starting families, and there's not nearly enough housing for all these people coming back who want houses. So the farmers in the areas surrounding the Twin Cities, including in this area, are land rich and cash poor, and they really want to bring utilities out to their farms. Mm-hmm. And so they start selling off land, and that becomes these emerging suburbs that we think of now.
So in the future Maplewood, there's stuff that's starting to percolate.
Yeah, there's
people
definitely
are living there. It's not a no man's land. It just is unincorporated.
Right. And I think one thing that's really interesting about this story, too, is that while parts of this were farm fields, certainly, I don't always think of some of these suburbs that don't historically have downtowns as having sort of history, like settlement history prior to them being suburbs. But that area right around Frost and English Street, where my dentist was as a kid, was this little town called Gladstone. It was this little, area where people congregated. It was where the township hall for New Canada Township was. And in the history books of Maplewood, it's really described as kind of like this little Wild West town.
Right.
And I just think it's cool because I think I never thought of that area as having a ton of history, at least, post-settlement.
Right. And the New Canada Town Hall was there, and that building is still standing.
It appears to be still standing,
It appears to
yeah.
be. We haven't gone and visited, but the Maplewood website sort of talks about it as this abandoned building, and we saw it on Google Street View, so we're pretty convinced it's still standing. But it was built in 1879, so
yes.
So that was sort of a hub, right?
Yeah, that was totally a community hub area, which figures into the next part of this story. The people in that area, there was some suburbanization in that area. People were building homes around the 1950s. And those people decided they wanted some modern amenities like, city water. And that would be a lot easier to do if they incorporated it as a village themselves.
Okay.
So what to incorporate? At the same time, it turned out 3M, which was a company founded, of course, in northern Minnesota. But 3M had moved to St. Paul, a long time ago. It was sort of growing in this area east of downtown. If you know where the St. Paul Police Department building was, one of the 3M spokespeople that I talked to for this story told me that that was actually a prior 3M building, which I thought was interesting. So 3M is looking to move. They've outgrown their area in the east area of downtown, and they want to move somewhere. They're interested in the East Metro because it's close to St. Paul, and it's close to where their employees live, especially as all this suburbanization is happening. But it would give them the space to build a campus that includes both kind of headquarters and the research facilities that they want to build. And
just to tee this up, so in your story, you note that like St. Paul was sort of thinking like, well, hey, okay, well, we'll annex that area over there too.
Yeah,
which
at
is
the
the
same
leg
time,
that we've been talking about.
Right. St. Paul was almost all the way out there anyway. It just had left that little leg to the eastern side. But what became Maplewood got there faster, right?
Okay.
And they managed to form a village and incorporate that whole leg and lump area where 3M ends up, building. So they've got this village, they've got 3M in their tax base, and it's very strangely shaped.
Yeah, so rather than like letting themselves continue to get chewed up by all these other villages and incorporated places, they themselves, the leftovers, became their own entity, and that's why it looks so strange.
Exactly.
Today. On the map, I'm sure it's a beautiful place. I'm just saying, on the map, it looks odd.
Yeah, you might think if you look at it on the map, it almost looks like that classic political cartoon of a gerrymander, but it's kind of the opposite in that, like, you think of a gerrymander as being deliberate, whereas Maplewood is made up of the leftovers, with the caveat that it seems it was deliberately incorporated to include where 3M was going to be.
Okay, and so they incorporated in late 50s, or when was that?
Yeah, it was in 1957 they incorporated.
Okay, and 3M, well, this is not just some company. Can you just talk about that a bit?
Minnesota, of course, lucky to have a lot of Fortune 500 companies, but at this time 3M was the biggest company in the state, and at the time was a third of Maplewood's tax base. So pretty big get for Maplewood, and loss for St. Paul, which has, historically tax-based challenged St. Paul.
Right. I mean, that may have changed St. Paul's fortunes quite a bit had it retained 3M, I imagine.
It certainly would, it would add to its tax base.
Okay. So it's called Maplewood. I don't know. I imagine a big grove of maple trees. I guess I haven't spent a ton of time there. Is that a signature part of Maplewood, or was it historically? Not
historically. So pre-settlement, the area was mostly prairie and oak savanna, so not notably full of maple trees. The executive director of the Maplewood Area Historical Society, TJ Molaski, told me he's heard 3 different potential origin stories for the name Maplewood.
Okay.
One was that one of these guys in talks of forming the village owned a nursery, and he sold maple trees, and I don't know, maybe thought it would be good to name the city Maplewood.
Yeah, sell some more maple trees.
Another sort of theory is that one of these guys who was involved in forming the village had lived on the East Coast, and there was a city called Maplewood that he wanted to name the city after. And another theory still is that there was actually a school in the area that was called Maplewood School, and the neighborhood around it was kind of called Maplewood, and so it may have come from there. It could have been any of those or any combination of them.
That last theory sounded pretty good. Isn't that, I mean, I don't know. If there was a school, if it was like an institution that was called Maplewood, but maybe that was named after some of these other things.
Could have been.
Interesting. Well, as we said at the top, like I was a little skeptical maybe when we first got this question, except then I started to realize we got many people asking the same question, which is always a sign that there's more to this. And, you know, this is like one of these border stories in the Twin Cities that is not, it is worth talking about. We don't need to talk about every border because every border has a story, but this one seems particularly odd, the border itself.
I think it's really, you know, like we talked about, it's the story of St. Paul. And it's also kind of the story of the suburbs. They're incorporating, and Maplewood happened to have incorporated out of what was left over.
Mm-hmm. And today, you know, you might drive through Maplewood and barely, you might not realize it because you're going through the leg of Maplewood or something like that. Right.
Yeah. You're kind of, you know, when you're going on 94 through the East Metro, you're in St. Paul, then you're in Maplewood, then you get out to, you know, Newport and Woodbury. Like it goes by quickly in that area because it's such a skinny part.
Right. Right. Well, great. Well, Greta, thank you so much for joining us. This is fascinating.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember that you can now read all Curious Minnesota stories at the Curious Minnesota Collection. Just go to startribune.com/curious. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Do you have feedback for us or a question you'd like us to tackle? Send us a note at curious@startribune.com. And if you're enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.